Join me in prayer. Creator God, our hearts are bursting today with the expectation of your coming to us once again as we remember and celebrate the birth of Jesus. We hear your voice today in the hope of the immigrant, the hunger of the homeless, the hurt of the refugee. Turn our hearts to the light of the stable. Tune our ears to the first cry of the newborn. Open us, body and soul, to the birth you would accomplish in each of us today and every day, to welcome you, to welcome all your wondrous world. In Jesus' name, amen.
We have a script. Okay, today we're going to light all 4 candles of the Advent wreath.
The first candle is called the prophet's candle, and it's the candle of hope for the coming of Messiah.
And I light the second candle, the Bethlehem candle, the candle of faith, as we remember the journey of Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem.
The third candle is the shepherd's candle, the candle of joy, glad tidings at the coming of the Christ.
And today, the angel's candle. The angel's candles, I'll listen to that. The candle of peace, remembering the declaration of peace on earth and goodwill toward all humanity.
And as we do each Sunday, we invite you to join your light with this light for the season, with a prayer. Eileen will lead us in O Come, Emmanuel, and we invite you to come forward and light a candle.
And that's on page 42 in your books. We're going to just keep singing it as we come forward.
Son of God appear.
sis, put this out for them. Stick this right here.
Brenda and Janice have our readings this morning.
From Richard Rohr's Daily Meditation, December 17th. When we speak of Advent or preparing for Christmas, we're not just talking about waiting for the little baby Jesus to be born. That already happened 2,000 years ago. In fact, we're welcoming the universal Christ, the cosmic Christ, the Christ that is forever being born in the human soul and into history. We do not have to make room for such a mystery because right now there is no room in the inn. We see things pretty much in their materiality, but we don't see the light shining through. We don't see the incarnate spirit that is hidden inside of everything material. We're always waiting to see spirit revealing itself through matter. We're always waiting for matter to become a new form in which spirit is revealed. Whenever that happens, we're celebrating Christmas. The gifts of incarnation just keep coming.
This is a reading from Isaiah, chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching.
Thank you, readers. So today's sermon comes from Leo Tolstoy. We're reading an adapted version of an original story of his. And the title is Papa Panov's Special Day. We won't be showing you the photos, I mean, the pictures. Okay. Well, we can. A long time ago, almost too long ago to remember, there lived an old shoemaker. His home was far away, almost too far to imagine, in a small Russian village. His name was Panov, but nobody called him Panov, or Mr. Panov, or even Shoemaker Panov. Wherever he went in the village, he was known as Papa Panov because everybody was so fond of him. Papa Panov was not very rich. All he owned in the world was one small room looking out onto the village street. And in that one room, he lived and slept and made shoes. But neither was he very poor. He had all his shoemaking tools, a beautiful cast iron stove to cook his food and warm his hands, a great wicker chair where he sat and snoozed, a good firm bed with a patchwork cover, and a little oil lamp to see by when evening crept in. And there were so many people who wanted new shoes made, or old ones patched and soled and healed, that Papa Panov always had enough money to buy bread from the bakers, coffee from the grocers, and cabbage to make his favorite soup.
So Papa Panov was quite happy, most of the time. Most of the time his eyes would sparkle through his little round spectacles, and he would sing and whistle and shout a cheery greeting to people passing by. But on this particular day it was different. Papa Panov stood sadly in the window of his little shop and thought of his wife who had died many years before, and of his sons and daughters who had all grown up and gone away. It was Christmas Eve, and everybody else was at home with their families. Papa Panov looked up the village street and saw windows bright with candles and lamps and Christmas trees, and he looked down the street and heard laughter and squeals of children playing games. And the faint smell of roasting meat crept through the cracks round the door and window of his little shop. "Dearie, dearie," said Papa Panov, pulling at his long gray mustache and shaking his head slowly from side to side. "Dearie, dearie." And there was nobody to bring back the sparkle behind his little round spectacles. Papa Panov sighed a great sigh. Then he slowly lit the oil lamp, went to a high shelf, and lifted down an old brown book.
First, the pictures.
I was a teacher.
He dusted some scraps of leather off the bench, set a pot of coffee on the stove, sat down in the great wicker chair, and began to read. Now, Papa Panov had never been to school and couldn't read very well, so as he went, he ran his finger along the lines, saying the words out loud. This was a story of Christmas. He read how a little boy, Jesus, was born, not in a good warm house, but in a cowshed, because there wasn't any room at the inn where his mother and father had asked to stay the night. "Dearie, dearie," said Papa Panov, pulling at his long mustache. "If they had come here, they could have slept on my good bed, and I would have covered the little boy with my patchwork quilt. I should like some company and a little child to play with." Papa Panov got up and poked the fire. It was becoming quite foggy outside, so he turned up the lamp. He poured himself a mug of coffee and went back to his book.
He read how the rich man traveled across the desert to bring wonderful presents for the little boy Jesus, presents of gold and sweet-smelling spices. "Dearie, dearie," sighed Papa Panov, "if Jesus came here, I shouldn't have anything to give him." Then he smiled and his eyes sparkled behind his little round spectacles. He got up from the table, went to the same high shelf, and took down a dusty box tied with a string. He opened the box and unwrapped a pair of tiny shoes. Papa Panov held one small shoe in each hand and stood very still. They were the best shoes he had ever made. "That's what I would have given him," he murmured at last as he put them lovingly away in their box and lowered his old limbs back into the great wicker chair. He sighed a deep sigh and turned his attention to the book once more. Now, whether it was the warmth of the room or whether it was because it was getting late, who can say? But it wasn't long before Papa Panov's bony fingers slid from the page. His little round spectacles slipped from his nose, and he fell sound asleep.
Outside, the fog grew thicker. Dim figures glided past the window, but the old shoemaker slumbered on, snoring gently. Suddenly, Papa Panov, said a voice in the room. The old man jumped. His gray mustache quivered. Who is it? He cried, looking about him vaguely. He could see so little without his spectacles, but there seemed to be no one there. Papa Panov, said the voice again, you wish that you had seen me, that I had come to your little shop and that you could bring me a gift. Look out into the street from dawn to dusk tomorrow, and I will come. Be sure you recognize me, for I shall not say who I am. Then all was quiet. Papa Panov rubbed his eyes and sat up with a start. The charcoal in the stove had burned low, and the lamp had gone out altogether. But outside, bells were ringing everywhere. Christmas had come. It was him, said the old man to himself. That was Jesus. He pulled at his mustache thoughtfully. Perhaps it was a dream. No matter. I'll watch and hope that he will visit me on Christmas Day. But how shall I know him? He was not always a little boy. He grew to be a man, a king. They said he was God himself. The old man shook his head. Dearie, dearie, he said slowly, I shall have to look very carefully.
Papa Panov did not go to bed that night. He sat in his wicker chair facing the window and kept watch for the very first person to pass that way. Little by little, the sun's rays crept up over the hill and began to brighten the long cobbled street outside. Nobody was coming yet. I'll just make a nice pot of coffee for my Christmas breakfast, said Papa Panov to himself cheerfully. So he stoked up the charcoal in the stove and brewed a huge jug of steaming coffee, keeping an eye on the window all the while. At last there was someone. A figure came into view at the far end of the winding road. Papa Panov pressed his face to the frosty glass. He was very excited. Perhaps this was Jesus coming to see him. Then he stepped back, disappointed. The figure was coming closer, trudging slowly up the street, stopping every now and then. Papa Panov knew who it was. The old road sweeper who came each week with his barrow and broom.
All right. Papa Panov felt cross. He had better things to do than watch out for an old road sweeper. He was waiting for God, for the King Jesus. He turned away from the window impatiently and waited till he thought the old fellow had passed by. But when he turned back, the road sweeper was there on the other side of the road, opposite Papa Panov's shop. He had set down his barrow and was rubbing his hands together and stamping his feet. Papa Panov felt sorry. The poor road sweeper did look very cold and fancy having to work on Christmas Day. Papa Panov tapped on the window, but the old fellow did not hear, so he went and opened the door of the little shop.
Hey, he called from the doorway. Hey, old chap. The road sweeper looked around anxiously. People were often very rude to him because of his job, but Papa Panov was smiling. How about a cup of coffee, he called. You look frozen to the marrow. The road sweeper left his barrow at once. Don't mind if I do, he said, coming into the tiny shop. It's very kind of you, very kind. Papa Panov was stirring the jug on the stove. It's the least I can do, he said over his shoulder. After all, it is Christmas. The old fellow sniffed. Well, this is all the Christmas I'll get. He took the mug of coffee that Papa Panov held out to him and shuffled across to warm himself at the stove. Then drifts of steam rose from his damp clothes, making a sour smell in the room.
Good job. Papa Panov returned to his place at the window and gazed up and down the street. You expecting visitors? Asked the old road sweeper. Not in a way, am I? Papa Panov shook his head. Have you heard of Jesus? He asked. Well, that's the same as God, isn't it? Said the old man. "He's coming today," replied Papa Panov. The old man looked at him in astonishment and slowly wiped his nose on the sleeve of his coat. So Papa Panov told him the whole story. "So that's why I'm watching out for him," he finished at last. The road sweeper set down his mug on the stove and shook his head gloomily. "Well, the best of luck," he said, and thanks for the coffee." For the first time, the road sweeper smiled. Then he hurried off down the street, collecting his barrow as he went.
Papa Panov stood in the open doorway and watched the road sweeper disappear. He looked up and down the street. The winter sun was shining brightly, and its rays even gave off a little warmth, which was melting the frost on the window and the slippery ice on the cobblestones. People were beginning to stir. A few drunks staggered home after the parties of the night before. Families in smart clothes hurried on their way to visit relatives. They nodded and smiled at Papa Panov as he stood on the threshold of his shop. "Happy Christmas, Papa Panov," they called, and the old shoemaker nodded and smiled back, but he did not stop them. He knew them all by name. He was waiting for someone else. He was just about to shut the door and go inside when something caught his eye. Stumbling along in the shadows close to the wall was a young woman carrying a baby. She was very thin, her face was tired, and her clothes were shabby.
Okay. Papa Panov watched her. She had almost passed the door when suddenly he called out, "Hello, why don't you come in for a warm?" She looked up, startled, and made as if to run away, but she saw the old shoemaker's eyes sparkling behind his spectacles. "You're very kind," she said, as he stood aside for her to enter his little shop. Papa Panov shrugged. "No, not really," he said. "You just look so cold. Have you got far to go?" "To the next village," she replied flatly, "about 4 miles. I used to lodge down at the mill, but I have no money left to pay the rent, so I must go and ask my cousin to take me in. I have no husband, you see."
Papa Panov went over to the stove where she was standing. "Will you share some bread and soup with me?" he asked, but the woman shook her head proudly. "Well, some warm milk for the child then," he said, lifting the baby from her arms. "Don't worry," his eyes sparkled. "I've had children of my own." And he heated a pan of milk and fed the baby on his lap. The child chuckled and kicked his feet. "Dearie, dearie," said Papa Panov, shaking his head, "the poor mite has no shoes." As Papa Panov sat feeding the little boy, a thought came into his mind. He pushed it away, but it came back. So he fetched the box from the high shelf. The pair of tiny shoes he had made so long ago exactly fitted the child's feet. "Perfect. There, you can have these," he said softly. The young woman was overjoyed. "How can I thank you enough?" she cried.
Little baby. But Papa Panov didn't hear. He was looking anxiously out the window. Had Jesus gone by while he was feeding the child? "Something the matter?" asked the young woman kindly. "Have you heard of Jesus who was born at Christmas?" replied the old shoemaker. The girl nodded. "Well, he's coming today," said Papa Panov. "He promised." And he told her all about the dream, if it was a dream. The young woman listened until he had finished. She looked as if she didn't believe him at all, but she patted the old shoemaker's hand kindly. "Well, I hope your dream comes true," she said. "You deserve it for being so good to me and the baby." And with that, she went on her way.
Papa Panov closed the door behind her, and after boiling up a big dish of cabbage soup for his dinner, took up his place at the window once again. Hours ticked by and people came and went. Papa Panov looked closely at everyone who passed, but Jesus did not come. Then he began to be afraid. Perhaps Jesus had come and he had not recognized him. Perhaps he had passed by quickly when Papa Panov had turned away just for a second to poke the fire or boil the soup. The old shoemaker could sit still no longer. He went to the door of the little shop for one last look. All sorts of people came by, children and old men, beggars and grannies, cheerful people and grumpy people, To some he gave a smile, to some a nod, and to the beggars a coin or a hunk of bread. But Jesus did not come.
Dusk fell and Papa Panov began to lose heart. The gray December fog was creeping up again, and soon he couldn't even make out the shapes of the few people who passed the window. Sadly, the old shoemaker lit his oil lamp, stoked up the fire, and made himself a little supper. When he had finished, he sat down wearily in the great wicker chair and took out his book to read, but his heart was too heavy, and his eyes were too tired to make out the words on the page. It was only a dream, after all, he said to himself. I wanted to believe it so much. I wanted him to come. And two great tears welled up behind his spectacles and filled his eyes so that he could hardly see.
At once it seemed as if there was someone in the room. Through his tears, Papa Panov seemed to see a long line of people passing across the little shop. The road sweeper was there, the woman with her child, all the people he had seen and spoken to that day. And as they passed, they whispered one by one, "Didn't you see me? Didn't you see me, Papa Panov?" "Who are you?" cried the old shoemaker, struggling out of his chair. "Who are you? Tell me."
And there came the same voice as the night before, though where it came from, Papa Panov could not have said. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me water. I was cold and you took me in. These people you have helped today, all the time you were helping them, you were helping me. Then everything was quiet. The tears dried in the old man's eyes, and there was no one to be seen.
"Dearie, dearie," said Papa Panov slowly, pulling at his long gray mustache. "So he came after all." The old shoemaker shook his head from side to side thoughtfully. Then he smiled, and the sparkle came back behind his little round spectacles.
At last. Next, the story.
I invite you to 2 minutes of silence, perhaps to reflect on the forever coming of Christ in your life.